Did you know in this simulation that I call life, we're all here to play a role? Yeah, we all have a part to play. And there's something I realized this last year, okay? In 2020, I've realized something very clearly, that we all are playing either one of four parts in life, okay? And this, especially when it comes to narratives, every one of us is playing a part in a narrative, okay? So there's really four roles that I've identified this year that I see people playing, and all of us are playing one of these four roles, okay? So 2020, narratives change over time, all right? But in 2020, I've discovered that they're really, and I've said this before, if you follow my material, if you listen to my videos, or listen to my podcast, you know that I've talked a lot about the narrative of 2020. There's really been two main narratives of 2020, okay? One narrative, obviously, has been the narrative of fear. So there's a lot of fear out there. I don't have to go into the reasons why there's fear. There's a lot of people that are afraid. No judgment if you've been afraid this year. Lots of us have. Okay, there's a lot of uncertainty. There's a lot of fear out there, right? So that's a narrative that's been out there in 2020. And also, in addition to the narrative of fear, there's been a narrative of outrage where people are rising up and challenging, structures and, governmental systems and all kinds of things. There's been a narrative of fear and there's been a narrative of outrage. This has been going on in 2020. Okay, so what I've observed is that all of us are playing a role in these narratives, okay? There's really four main roles that I've identified. And so what I'd like to do in this video is talk to you a little bit about what those four roles are. And I would love for you to identify what role you've been playing, and also what role do you want to play, okay? So I would love for you to wake up to the role you desire to play, and I'd love for you to embrace that role and to choose that role, okay? Because all the roles are needed in this simulation that we call life, okay? So here's the first role, okay? The first role is the role of the narrative driver. So there's a certain amount of people in our society, this is true in every society, they drive whatever narrative there is, they drive the narrative. So there's been people this year driving the narrative of fear, driving the narrative of outrage, okay? People who are narrative drivers are people who have tended to really personally identify with that narrative. And because of that, they're so identified with that narrative, they feel it almost like a sense of responsibility or duty to make sure that everybody else follows that narrative. And people who do not follow that narrative, the narrative drivers become very aggressive towards. They want to silence them. Typically, again, this is a generalization, but typically if you're a narrative driver, you do not like it when other people have different narratives. You feel threatened in some way. You feel that's dangerous. You feel that people need to be silenced. So usually narrative drivers will try to silence other people, usually through the means of, usually it's ridicule or shame. Sometimes it's character assassination, when it gets very severe. And sometimes it's just outright censorship where they just try to shut the voice down, okay? That's what narrative drivers typically do. Believe it or not, I don't oppose those folks. I don't think they're bad people. I just think it's a role they're playing, okay? We need people to play that role. This is a simulation, okay? We call it life. There are people playing that role. So there are the narrative drivers. Narrative drivers tend to be fear-driven because they are afraid that other narratives will replace their narrative. This isn't usually conscious. This is almost always subconscious. But they're afraid of losing their own narrative, so they kind of go on the attack and try to silence those with different narratives, okay? Usually shame, ridicule, aggressive tactics, or just the outright censorship by cutting people off or silencing people. That's what narrative drivers do, okay? Every society has them. We have them. 2020 has shown us there are lots of narrative drivers out there, okay? So that's a role that people play. Second role that people play, all right, they aren't narrative drivers, but they are driven by the narrative. By and large, the vast majority of people are people who are just driven by a narrative. People who are driven by a narrative, they tend to not question things too deeply. They just really want to get along. They want to just live their life. They don't want to challenge things. So they usually just accept what the narrative drivers are giving to them. So those people who are driven by a narrative just blindly kind of accept what's given to them. And they only change their narrative when the narrative drivers change their narrative. So they follow the narrative drivers pretty closely. Whatever the narrative drivers are saying, people who are driven by a narrative pretty much just accept without question. Okay? So the vast majority of people fall into that role. Believe it or not, people are here to play that role. Okay? It's part of the simulation. The third role that people play is they play the role of people who are here to awaken to their own internal narrative. Okay? That's the third role that people play. They're here to awaken to their own internal narrative. And that's a smaller minority of people, but they're waking up. They're here to, they internally question what they're told, and they wake up to something vastly different. And they just ponder that, and they begin to move into alignment with it, and their life comes into alignment with a new internal narrative. Okay? And oftentimes this new internal narrative is at odds with the external narrative, but they just wake up to their own internal narrative, and they don't resist the external narrative. They just live according to their own narrative. Okay? And then there's the fourth group of people, the fourth role that people play. Okay? And this role is not only that of those who awaken to an internal narrative, but they are here to challenge the narrative. Okay? So this fourth group, this fourth role that people play is they wake up to their own internal narrative, but then they also feel compelled to challenge the narrative that the narrative drivers are driving on society. So these are the folks that ask questions, that cause people to think. They like to help people to deconstruct old narratives, okay? But a lot of these folks are doing it from a place of alignment. That's the fourth role, okay? It's the fourth role to play. They're narrative challengers, okay? So here's my question for you. What role have you been playing? Have you been a narrative driver? Are you one who's driven by a narrative? Are you someone who's awakening to your own internal narrative? Or are you the fourth group, someone who's awakening to your own internal narrative, but you're also challenging the narrative? What role are you playing? And here's another question. What role do you want to play? You can choose any one of these, but you have to choose according to desire. Which role do you want to play out of the four I just listed? It's a good question, okay? So here's what I would like to ask you to do. Choose today which role you want to play, number one. And number two, I want you to accept the role that other people are playing without judgment. We need all four of these roles to be played in this simulation called life. It's very important. So accept your role with joy, and also accept the role that other people are playing without resistance. Don't resist their roles. You're not here to resist their roles. You're only here to embrace your role. I hope this makes sense. Okay. If you'd like some more information from me, go to my website, jamaljavanji.com. You can scroll to the bottom, put your email address in there. You'll get on my mailing list. You're going to want to do that for this next year. Okay. Or you can have a free Facebook group that's called Uprooting from the Poverty Mindset. Do a search for that on Facebook. You'll have to answer like 3 questions and you'll get admitted to that group. Love to have you part of that.